Tensions between the United States and Canada have escalated rapidly in recent months, triggering a series of retaliatory actions that have disrupted both economies. The conflict began when the U.S. government, under President Donald Trump, imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian aluminum and steel imports. While the U.S. justified the move as a way to protect domestic industries, many viewed it as an aggressive economic strike against a close ally. Canada responded swiftly, with Ontario Premier Doug Ford taking decisive action. In a bold countermeasure, Ford imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to key U.S. states such as Minnesota, Michigan, and New York, states heavily dependent on Canadian power to sustain businesses and households. This move significantly impacted energy costs, potentially increasing household electricity bills by an estimated $100 per month and placing an additional $400,000 daily burden on these state economies. U.S. officials reacted with outrage, accusing Canada of weaponizing essential resources amid the growing trade dispute. The situation escalated further when Trump retaliated by doubling down on Canadian tariffs, announcing plans to raise duties on steel and aluminum from 25% to 50%. This announcement sent shockwaves through financial markets, leading to panic among investors and business leaders. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted nearly 600 points before partially recovering to close down 478 points, following a steep 900-point decline the previous day. Similarly, the S&P 500 dropped by 0.7%, while the Nasdaq Composite dipped by 0.2%. Analysts warned that if the standoff continued, disruptions could extend across industries, such as automotive manufacturing and consumer electronics, potentially triggering a broader economic downturn or even a recession. As tensions mounted, political leaders from both countries scrambled to find a resolution. Premier Ford, despite his initial firm stance, recognized the economic risks. With increasing pressure from industry leaders and economists, he initiated high-level discussions with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Officials described the talks as productive, though details were scarce. After intense negotiations, Ford took the first step toward de-escalation by temporarily suspending the 25% electricity surcharge. This was seen as a strategic move rather than a concession, as Ford made it clear that the surcharge could be reinstated if the U.S. did not negotiate in good faith. The strategy appeared effective. Trump responded by retracting his plan to raise tariffs to 50%, instead keeping them at the original 25%. Though the situation remained uncertain, the episode highlighted how quickly economic and political pressures can influence international policy. The Ontario government defended its actions, emphasizing that it had successfully demonstrated its willingness to stand firm in trade disputes. Canada demonstrated its ability to push back against aggressive U.S. trade policies. Ford's office issued a statement affirming Ontario's commitment to defending its economy and ensuring fair trade, emphasizing that the province would not hesitate to use its own leverage when necessary. However, despite the temporary truce, some damage had already been done. Financial markets remained uneasy. Businesses faced uncertainty about long-term trade stability, and both governments were under pressure from their respective industries to negotiate a better deal. The dispute also raised broader concerns about the fragility of U.S.-Canada trade relations. Historically cooperative, the relationship had become increasingly unpredictable, with escalating conflicts highlighting just how interdependent the two economies are. The U.S. and Canada share one of the world's largest trading partnerships, with bilateral trade reaching approximately $773 billion in 2024. This staggering figure underscores the reality that even minor disruptions can have significant economic repercussions, especially for businesses reliant on cross-border trade. Industries across both nations felt the impact. Auto manufacturers that depend on Canadian steel and aluminum, as well as American companies sourcing raw materials from Canada, struggled with rising costs and supply chain disruptions. Consumers, too, bore the consequences as tariffs drove up aluminum prices. Everyday products like cars, appliances, and beverage cans became more expensive. While some industries attempted to absorb the increased costs, many had no choice but to pass them on, leading to noticeable price hikes at checkout. In the U.S., state officials voiced frustration with Washington's approach. Governors from Minnesota, Michigan, and New York called for a rollback of tariffs and urged the federal government to pursue a diplomatic resolution. Michigan's governor emphasized that the tariffs were harming working-class Americans, urging Washington to prioritize businesses and families over political maneuvering. The auto industry, in particular, found itself at the center of the trade dispute. American car manufacturers have long relied on Canadian steel and aluminum to keep production costs low. The tariffs not only raised raw material expenses, but also disrupted long-established supply chains. Major automakers like Ford and General Motors expressed concerns, warning that higher costs could lead to layoffs, reduce production, and ultimately, increase car prices for consumers. Other industries also felt the impact of the trade dispute, including consumer electronics, construction, and agriculture. Many products that relied on Canadian imports, ranging from machinery parts and household appliances to packaging materials, became more expensive. Retailers faced rising costs, which trickled down to consumers already struggling with inflation and economic uncertainty. Small businesses were particularly vulnerable. Many local manufacturers and suppliers that depended on cross-border trade saw their profit margins shrink. Some were forced to seek alternative suppliers, while others had no choice but to absorb the increased costs and cut expenses elsewhere. Trade experts warned that if the conflict continued, smaller businesses would be at serious risk of shutting down. With so much at stake, attention turned to the next round of negotiations. Would Canada and the U.S. find common ground, or was this just the beginning of a prolonged economic standoff? The uncertainty weighed heavily on both nations as they prepared for the next phase of the dispute. Beyond economic retaliation, the trade tensions also fueled a surge of nationalism in Canada. As tariffs and countermeasures disrupted trade, Canadian leaders and citizens responded in ways that extended beyond government policies. The conflict was no longer just about steel, aluminum, or electricity. It had become a matter of national pride. In response to U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, the Canadian government swiftly implemented its own countermeasures. Canada imposed a 25% tariff on nearly $30 billion worth of U.S. imports, targeting a broad range of American goods. The tariffs covered not only steel and aluminum, but also consumer products such as computers, sports equipment, and cast iron items. This move sent a strong message that Canada would not passively accept unfair trade practices. Provinces also took independent action against what they saw as economic aggression. Ontario, after temporarily suspending its electricity surcharge, continued to push back. Premier Doug Ford reiterated that Canada would not be intimidated and warned that Ontario would reinstate trade restrictions if the U.S. escalated its policies. At the same time, he encouraged businesses to explore alternative markets and supply chains to reduce reliance on American goods. Quebec followed suit with its own measures. Premier François Legault took a bureaucratic approach, instructing the Provincial Treasury Board to review all government procurement contracts involving American suppliers. These efforts reflected a broader movement across Canada to resist economic pressure and assert the country's independence in trade matters. The goal was clear: prioritize Canadian or non-U.S. partners whenever possible to reduce reliance on American goods and services. Quebec also took a symbolic yet impactful step by removing all American liquor products from store shelves. The province's liquor board, Société des Alcools du Québec, SAQ, followed Ontario's lead and banned the sale of American alcoholic beverages. This action was part of a broader strategy to send a strong message to U.S. businesses. If the American government was going to impose aggressive trade measures, Canadian consumers could respond by shifting their spending elsewhere. Across Canada, citizens began advocating for a boycott of American products. Social media saw a surge in support, with hashtags like #BuyCanadian and #SupportLocal trending. People shared lists of Canadian alternatives to American brands, encouraging others to support local businesses instead of U.S. corporations. British Columbia took a different but equally effective approach. Premier David Eby urged the federal government to impose a tax on American thermal coal exports passing through BC ports. This move served a dual purpose, retaliating against U.S. tariffs while aligning with environmental priorities. American coal producers have been using Canadian ports due to restrictions on building new export facilities along the U.S. West Coast. By imposing a levy on these exports, Canada could directly impact another key American industry. Environmental advocacy groups, such as Dogwood BC, quickly backed the proposal. They had long opposed American thermal coal shipments through British Columbia due to pollution and climate concerns. The proposed tax gave them additional leverage to push for stronger environmental regulations while also reinforcing Canada's position in the trade dispute. Initially, Alberta was hesitant to take drastic action due to its historically strong trade ties with the U.S. However, Premier Danielle Smith eventually shifted her stance, supporting strategic tariffs on American goods that could be sourced from Canada or other international partners. This demonstrated a growing national consensus that Canada was prepared to push back against U.S. trade policies using all available economic and political tools. Alberta also began exploring ways to diversify its supply chains to lessen dependence on U.S. imports. Unlike some provinces that took immediate retaliatory measures, Alberta focused on a long-term economic strategy aimed at reducing vulnerability to American trade policies. Nova Scotia, on the other hand, adopted a more direct and symbolic approach. Premier Tim Houston announced that highway tolls for U.S. vehicles traveling through the province will be doubled. Additionally, the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation followed the precedent set by Ontario and Quebec by halting the sale of American liquor. These moves were intended to send a strong message that Canadian provinces were willing to take concrete action in response to U.S. economic aggression. Manitoba and Prince Edward Island took an even firmer stance, implementing a complete ban on the import of American liquor. Premiers Wab Kinew and Dennis King defended their decisions as necessary measures to protect Canada's economic sovereignty. Their argument was straightforward. Canadian businesses and workers should not bear the burden of an unfair trade war initiated by the United States. In Yukon, Premier Ranj Pillai also took action by suspending all imports of U.S. alcohol and reviewing government contracts involving American suppliers. The territory even considered introducing tolls for U.S. vehicles passing through its borders, though this measure was temporarily put on hold pending further negotiations. While these provincial initiatives gained traction, the Canadian federal government continued diplomatic efforts behind the scenes. Prime Minister-designate Mark Carney signaled his readiness to engage in discussions with President Trump, but maintained that any agreement must uphold Canada's sovereignty. Carney stated, "I am prepared to meet with President Trump, provided that our national sovereignty is fully respected and that we work towards mutually beneficial trade solutions." This trade dispute is reshaping North America's automotive industry and sending ripple effects through other key sectors, with tariffs increasing production costs for U.S. automakers. Vehicles like the Ford F-150, a best-selling truck in North America, are now more expensive to produce. Analysts estimate that aluminum tariffs alone could add approximately $400 per truck, a cost that may be passed on to consumers or result in cost-cutting measures affecting production quality and jobs. General Motors, Stellantis, and Tesla are also facing similar pressures, with rising raw material costs threatening their global competitiveness. The increased expense of U.S.-made vehicles could make them less attractive in international markets, compounding the economic uncertainty. Meanwhile, in Canada, the situation is just as dire. Ontario's automotive sector, a major supplier of parts to U.S. automakers, is grappling with higher costs and an unpredictable trade environment. Many manufacturers in Ontario's automotive corridor are already looking for alternatives, exploring new partnerships with European and Asian automakers to reduce dependence on the U.S. Beyond the auto industry, this trade war has driven a surge in Canadian nationalism. Trump's provocative suggestion that Canada should become the 51st U.S. state was met with overwhelming rejection, with 90% of Canadians opposing the idea in polls. The backlash has only reinforced Canada's commitment to economic independence and self-reliance. While tensions remain high, experts caution that prolonged retaliation could harm both economies. Business leaders on both sides of the border are urging a resolution, emphasizing that free trade has historically benefited both nations. With negotiations ongoing, the world is watching to see whether diplomacy can prevail or if this economic standoff will escalate further. The long-term effects of the trade war between the U.S. and Canada are proving to be far-reaching, with American industries feeling the strain of increased costs and supply chain disruptions. The ongoing tariffs threaten to destabilize U.S. car companies, which have relied on Canada as a key supplier for decades. The rising costs of raw materials, particularly aluminum and steel, have already impacted major automakers like Ford, GM, Stellantis, and Tesla. With Canada seeking alternative trade partners, U.S. manufacturers could lose access to a stable and cost-effective supplier base, making American-made vehicles more expensive and less competitive in global markets. The consumer electronics industry is also facing turbulence. Computers, which have been a crucial product in cross-border trade, are now subjected to higher import duties, forcing American businesses to either absorb the costs, pass them on to consumers, or look for alternative suppliers, such as China. However, with existing supply chain issues in China, these alternatives are not without challenges. Household appliances and sporting goods have also been affected. Canadian-made products like hockey sticks, bicycles, and fitness equipment, staples in North America, are now significantly more expensive for U.S. consumers. Retailers and distributors in the U.S. are struggling to keep prices competitive, and in some cases, Canadian manufacturers are losing their edge in the market. One of Canada's most significant countermeasures in the trade dispute is the proposed tax on American thermal coal exports passing through British Columbia's ports. This move, championed by Premier David Eby, has gained traction among environmental groups like Dogwood BC, who argue against transporting U.S. coal through Canadian territory due to pollution concerns. Beyond environmental factors, this policy is a direct economic blow to the U.S. coal industry, which relies heavily on Canadian ports to reach Asian markets. In 2023 alone, the Port of Vancouver handled approximately 17.6 million metric tons of thermal coal, with about 11.7 million metric tons originating from the U.S., primarily from Montana and Wyoming's Powder River Basin. If Canada restricts or heavily taxes these exports, American coal producers will face logistical nightmares. The U.S. lacks major West Coast ports capable of handling such large export volumes, meaning coal producers could suffer major financial losses, mine closures, and widespread job cuts. As tensions remain high, both sides face economic risks that could reshape North American trade permanently. Canadian provinces are taking unprecedented actions to counteract U.S. policies, while American businesses scramble to adapt. Whether through diplomacy or continued economic standoffs, the future of U.S.-Canada trade remains uncertain, making the next round of negotiations crucial for both countries. It's clear that the U.S.-Canada trade war has escalated beyond just tariffs. It's fundamentally reshaping supply chains, industries, and even national sentiment. Here's an expanded version of your text with more detail and clarity. The coal industry and economic leverage in coal-dependent states across the U.S. The lack of alternative export routes has created a major challenge. With limited transportation options, the cost of shipping coal to international markets has risen significantly, making U.S. coal less competitive on the global stage. This economic disadvantage has given Canada a powerful tool in the ongoing trade dispute. By imposing restrictions or additional fees on U.S. coal exports that rely on Canadian ports, Canada can exert pressure on American policymakers. This strategy is part of a broader effort by the Canadian government to counterbalance U.S. tariffs that have been placed on key Canadian industries. Another major sector feeling the effects of this trade conflict is agriculture. Farmers in both Canada and the U.S. have expressed serious concerns about how tariffs are disrupting trade flows, affecting market prices, and increasing economic uncertainty. Canada is one of the largest buyers of American agricultural products, particularly crops such as wheat, corn, and soybeans, as well as dairy and meat products. In response to U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods, Canada has implemented retaliatory tariffs on American farm exports. These measures have led to billions of dollars in losses for U.S. farmers, who are already struggling with declining commodity prices and global competition. At the same time, Canadian agricultural exports, especially beef and grain, have encountered higher costs and additional barriers when trying to access the American market. The result has been a decline in trade volumes and financial losses for Canadian farmers. The effects of these disruptions have extended beyond just farmers. The entire agricultural supply chain, including transportation, processing, and retail, has felt the impact. Grocery stores and food distributors in both countries have reported difficulties in securing supplies at stable prices. These challenges have created ripple effects, leading to increased food costs for consumers and raising concerns about long-term food security and economic stability. The trade war has forced businesses in both nations to rethink their supply chains. Many Canadian companies that traditionally relied on U.S. imports have started seeking alternative suppliers from Europe and Asia to mitigate risks and avoid tariffs. This shift has begun reshaping long-established trade relationships and could have long-term consequences for North American economic integration. Meanwhile, American retailers have struggled to absorb the rising costs of Canadian imports. The increased tariffs on goods from Canada have driven up prices for raw materials, consumer products, and essential supplies. As a result, U.S. businesses are either passing these costs on to consumers, leading to higher prices on everyday goods, or are being forced to cut expenses elsewhere, potentially leading to job losses and reduced investment in growth. The financial markets have remained volatile throughout the trade dispute. Investors are increasingly concerned that if tensions continue to escalate, both the U.S. and Canadian economies could face long-term economic consequences.